Hello YouTube, this is the first video that I've ever made, so it's going to be really amateurish, but I've been wanting to do this for a while, so finally getting around to it. But it's basically just going to be me ranting about my views on consciousness, and it's not like I'm an expert on consciousness or anything like that, but it is a subject that I've been interested in for a little while, and over the past few years I've just been looking around, casually doing research on particularly alternative theories of consciousness, and I've put together some ideas, so I thought I'd share them. And I know that if somebody else did something similar, I'd appreciate if they shared with everyone, so I figured I might as well do the same. So to start, I guess I'll say that usually there is usually people have the idea that consciousness is a product of the brain. That's like the mainstream view. That's the mainstream scientific academic view that you'll learn, is that consciousness is a product of the brain, and that your brain produces consciousness through, firing neurons and mixing chemicals and doing whatever it does, and that actually generates and makes consciousness. But there are other theories out there, and I find that they're more convincing because there are a lot of examples and even experiences that I've had where it seems as if consciousness is not tethered to the brain, that consciousness can separate out of the body and out of the brain through out-of-body experiences, astral projections, different experiences that people have, past life experiences even, that consciousness, that when the brain stops working and stops firing neurons and doing what it does, consciousness seems to continue. So I think that there's more to it than just the materialistic view. And my favorite theory is unified field theory, which is actually a particular view on unified field theory, which goes a little bit of a step further and says that the unified field is consciousness. So just I'm not an expert on unified field theory, but just to give you guys a little bit of a background if you don't know what that is, it's basically an extension of superstring theory, or M theory, which is similar to superstring theory. But what it is like, okay, so you have to start with superstring theory. So superstring theory is saying that basically all of the fundamental particles that make up everything that exists are actually vibrating superstrings, and they vibrate at different frequencies to produce or to become these different fundamental particles. So everything that exists has a fundamental particle to it, including things that aren't even really things, forces, light, stuff like that. Everything has a fundamental particle, and superstring theory is saying instead of all these different particles that exist, they're all actually strings, and they're just vibrating at different frequencies. So unified field theory takes it a step further and says, okay, if all the fundamental particles are strings, what are the strings? And what it says is they're made out of this thing called the unified field. So it's a field because it's completely pervasive everywhere, and it's unified because everything that exists is this field. So basically how it works is like a superstring will be vibrating, and it will have equal amounts of opposite force or opposite energy. I don't know the exact term, but equal amounts of opposites. And if you really look at it closely, it turns out that it's almost like there's nothing there. It's just a vibrating piece of space almost. It's like a piece of outer space, or not a piece, but a quantum of outer space that is vibrating. I think I've heard the term quantum vacuum fluctuations to describe superstrings. So very, very small wiggles in the space, vibrations in space. And so one of the ways I like to think about it is, if you have a really, really flat lake bed, like a dried up lake bed in the desert, and it's completely flat as far as the eye can see, and that's fine, but it's kind of boring, so you decide, okay, I'm going to take a shovel and dig a 3-foot hole, in the surface of the bed, and then what ends up beside it is a 3-foot hill. So you end up with like this sine wave, right? And so it looks like there's something there. If you look at it, it's just flat, and then, oh, there's something over there. But you look at it a little more closely, and it's actually, there's nothing there. It's just a fluctuation in the neutralness. So space is like neutral, and the string is like opposite positive and negative together, vibrating, balancing itself out. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is the unified field is neutral, and the unified field, in my view, is consciousness. So another word to describe that would be just basically outer space. You could say space itself is consciousness, outer space, inner space, and you hear this term a lot in the spiritual community. People like Eckhart Tolle will say things like, space, the dimension of spaciousness, and to be fully conscious is to like have space and be space. Well, I think it's actually like pretty literal that consciousness is space, and space obviously is neutral. So another word to describe it would be neutrality, right? Another word to describe it would be non-dual, non-dualistic. It's the only thing that exists that is non-dualistic, because after that, once a superstring pops into existence, you've got duality, you've got the opposite, you've got two opposites working, right? But before that, there's no opposites, there's no duality. And that makes it difficult to describe consciousness and give it a word, because usually words have opposites to them. So, any word that you give it, you can't really give it a word. Either you don't name it at all, or one of the names I've heard for it is the nameless, or you have to name it something, and at the same time take the opposite antonym and use it at the same time to describe it, the same thing. So I'll come back to that later, but basically when you have the unified field making all the superstrings that exist, everything that exists has a fundamental particle, with the exception of space, which is defined by the lack of a fundamental particle. But you could say that it's everything that exists. Everything that exists is consciousness. It's like a matrix. Well, it's a field that's unified. That's why it's called the unified field. It's completely unified. Everything that exists is this field at that level. Once you get really small enough at that level, it's completely unified. So one of the things that people will name it is like the source. I've heard that term a lot. It's the source of everything that exists. You can't exist without the space in which to exist. You need to have the space, and then out of that, these superstrings kind of pop out of that neutralness and start vibrating and start existing. But without that, they can't even exist in the first place. So it's the source of everything that exists. Or you could say God, omnipotent, omnipresent, stuff like that. Those are good ways to describe the unified field, or consciousness as well. And to get back to the thing about opposite words, one of the words I've heard is emptiness. That's very similar to space. Outer space is empty. it's almost like nothing exists there except the space itself. It's like the quality of space is like the lack of something existing almost. So it's emptiness, but at the same time, you have to go around and say, it's the fullness. Because everything that exists, me, my thoughts, you, people's emotions, everything that you see, everything that exists, is that emptiness. So it's emptiness and fullness at the same time. You have to go for both, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So it can get kind of confusing. I'm sure, maybe I've lost some people already. I'm not doing great at describing this. Kind of nervous for this video, but that would be one good way to describe it, and I've heard that before. And let me think. Some other words for it. Well, silence is a good one. Stillness. Again, those are qualities of space. Those are qualities of consciousness. Another good one is the Tao. If you guys are familiar with the Tao Te Ching, is an ancient book about consciousness and about duality and opposites. And the very first line of the Tao Te Ching is something like, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the eternal Tao, or is not the true Tao, something like that. And it doesn't seem to make sense, but if you replace the word Tao with the word consciousness, it makes a lot more sense, because the consciousness that you can be conscious of is not the true eternal consciousness, right? You can't be conscious of consciousness itself. You can't be aware of awareness as if you were to be aware of other things. Normally you can be aware of stuff, but to be aware of awareness itself, if you're aware of the awareness, what are you aware of it with? With a deeper awareness, right? With a more true, more eternal consciousness. So I think the first line of the Tao is basically saying you can't be conscious of consciousness in the way that you would expect to be. It just doesn't work that way. And that's a pretty powerful paradox and a pretty powerful spiritual teaching. I've heard, people like Eckhart say things like that, and other people. But I think that's pretty much the key, to understanding consciousness, is you can't be aware of it almost, other than just to be purely aware, like in a meditative state, without actually being aware of it, just being aware, period. So that would be another definition of it. And then that goes back to something that I heard again Eckhart Tolle say in a lecture. I think he has a pretty good way of explaining it, or maybe it's just a way that makes sense to me. But he was explaining this and saying, he brought up a line from the New Testament where he says, the kingdom of heaven does not come with signs to be perceived. You can't say it's over there or it's over here, but truly I tell you, the kingdom of heaven is within you. So I think I didn't quite quote that right, but it's, again, basically it's talking about consciousness again. So another synonym would be heaven. Sometimes people refer to heaven or the heavens as space, like outer space, physically, but also some type of inner realm of peace and stillness, which is another good synonym, or maybe not a synonym, but a quality would be peace. But anyway, that's those are some synonyms for consciousness and some of my view on what consciousness is. And obviously it's a very different view from the normal view, but I think it's a view that is coming more and more into the mainstream and more popular, becoming more and more popular. So I'm going to be doing a few more videos similar to this, where I'll just go through my view on the structure of consciousness, the levels of consciousness in terms of chakras and in terms of slightly more scientific terms, and just kind of laying it out how I see it. And maybe for those people who are interested in alternative theories of consciousness, or more, so to speak, spiritual views on consciousness, maybe hopefully this will help somebody to get the gears turning, get them started on, their own research and their own personal realizations of what their consciousness is, and help them to expand their awareness through becoming more aware, more informed about this type of thing. So, thanks.